All right. So, welcome to the Collaborative Center's Climate and Health Seminar Series. We're excited to launch this particular seminar series around climate change and mental health. This first one is called Climate Change and the Developing and Aging Brain, considering both early development in utero to adolescence and late life brain, where we will hear from doctors Sean Kidd and Eric Brown from CAMH. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, the Collaborative Centre for Climate, Health and Sustainable Care is an academic unit at the University of Toronto that catalyzes climate and sustainability research, education, and practice change in clinical care, health system management, health policy, and public health. The Collaborative Center is an initiative of four faculties: the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, the Temerty Faculty of Medicine, the Lawrence Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing, and the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. The Climate and Health Seminar Series brings together international and local experts through seminars, workshops, and roundtables, working in partnership with other centers of excellence. So I'd like to open this session, first of all, by introducing myself. My name is Ashley Aimone. I am an assistant professor in the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, and I will introduce our speakers shortly, but first I want to open with a land acknowledgement. And so for those of you who are also joining us from Toronto, which is the land on which the University of Toronto operates. It is more appropriately known as Takaronto, which is a Mohawk word meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing, the place where the fish weirs are. Today, there are concrete sidewalks and parking lots that now cover the rivers and trails that once flowed freely, and where the Petun, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, and the Mississaugas all made their homes. And many other nations expanding beyond these groups traveled through for commerce and trade for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So I encourage all of us, whether you're here in Takaronto or somewhere else on Turtle Island, to try to find out whose land you're on, to ask the question, who are the original occupants here? So that we can acknowledge the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples, as well as to feel more connected to a place. And so this seminar, just to take you briefly through the agenda, after I'm finished with the introductions, we'll hear from Dr. Kidd and Dr. Brown for around 35 or 40 minutes. Then we'll leave some time for question and answer, and we'll close at around 1 p.m., after which those of you in person can enjoy a nice lunch. I wish I was there. I'm battling the flu that everyone's getting right now, but I hope you enjoy the nice lunch until 2 p.m. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. I'm not sure who's going first, so I'm just going to go in the order that I have it. I'll start with Dr. Eric Brown, who is the Associate Chief and an inpatient psychiatrist in the Geriatric Psychiatry Division at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, or CAMH. He is an associate scientist in the Campbell Family Mental Health Research Institute and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry, University of Toronto. Dr. Brown's clinical and research focus is on the mental health of older adults, including to understand the broad range of factors that contribute to cognitive impairment and dementia. Dr. Sean Kidd is a senior scientist with the Slate Family Center for Youth in Transition at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and an associate professor in the University of Toronto's Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Kidd's areas of focus have included developing and trialing interventions for individuals with severe mental illness and youth who have experienced homelessness. His research has included trials of cognitive and critical time interventions for schizophrenia spectrum populations, housing stabilization interventions for homeless youth, digital health interventions for severe mental illness, and global health work in the area of climate change and homelessness. He has founded global and national networks related to health equity and climate change and co-leads climate-related initiatives at CAMH. Welcome, Dr. Kidd and Dr. Brown. I will turn the floor over to you.
Hey, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, Ashley. And we're doing a little bit of scrambling here, as is always the case with hybrid meetings. The tech always is a little bit interesting. So we're gonna launch right in. I'm gonna go first, and then Eric next, and then we have a healthy amount of time for lots of discussion and questions, hopefully. So with that, hopefully I'm coming through okay. Go. Okay, so for myself, I've just noted here some of the funders of the work I'm going to speak about. Just noting I have no disclosures, and I'm going to share the website again at the end. But I'm going to cover a fair bit, as will Eric. But there's certainly lots of places to read more about what we're covering. We're kind of giving a fairly high level overview, so lots of places to read more, and that website is certainly one of them. So thanks, Ashley, as well for doing the land acknowledgement. I just wanted to tease out for myself the Truth and Reconciliation called action number 18, and just really highlighting the point about implementing healthcare rights and the idea that acknowledging and building knowledge is important, but as important or more important is acting on that, and certainly a part of everything we've been doing. I think one of the pieces I've been really excited about recently are some participatory action films. One that's coming out made by young people in Yellowknife, which of course had a whole city evacuation a couple of years ago. They did a hip hop video related to their experience at the evacuation as youth have experienced homelessness. And of course, it disproportionately affects Indigenous youth in the North. So so trying to walk the walk here. I'm not going to go to town on the health implications of climate change. Just going to give a bit of a high level overview. I think most of you or all of you probably are familiar with this, and certainly there's lots of places to go. But I think it is important, especially important right now when we're unfortunately in a situation where there's a fair bit of disinformation and distraction, is to keep centered on what's happening with climate change and the threats it does pose, not just to human health and well-being, but the health and well-being of our entire ecosystem. Again, just a bit of an overview, just level set a bit is, of course, climate change has really cross-cutting and rather complicated and complex impacts, implications for physical health, mental health, well-being, social well-being, cultural well-being, kind of across the board. The impacts are direct, like with fires, extreme storms, which have an immediate impact on people and communities, or indirect and very subtle at times. It can be the spread of disease. It can be increases in domestic violence, all of these things that cascade out from environmental risks. I should say, too, you might have heard the term threat multiplier. It basically means that if you, in the social and structural determinants of health, you're experiencing some disadvantages, some challenges, as climate change doubles down on all of that. In other words, if there's a disparity there already, climate change makes it worse. And that's very evident. I'm going to speak to that for a bit in what I'm going to be speaking about. A good one-stop shop for all things climate change and health. And it's open access, so I encourage you to look at is the every year around this time of year, usually November, the Lancet, which is a journal, a health journal, they released something called the Countdown on the Climate Impacts of Health, and I put the title of the most recent one here. This is a really nice review of all the main considerations. So if you do want to kind of go to a place to get a lot more detail, that's a good one. But where I'm going to start here is we're shifting gears, and I think a lot of the discussion about climate change and its implications for mental health and addictions kind of in a more expansive way. Many of you will be aware of lots of discussions about climate-related anxiety, climate distress. I mean, that certainly is in the news a lot. It's in a lot of our lives. I know certainly I hear about it from my daughter. Well, she's more climate angry than climate anxious, I would say. But the work I'm going to speak to for myself here came out of a review we did recently, which is more about the developmental implications of climate change, mostly on the brain end of things, even though, brain health and mental health are kind of very intertwined and in some ways the same thing. But it was a disturbing review. We tried to look at, this is open access as well. We tried to look at, like, what are the implications from in utero to youth stages of all things climate change? So heat, lack of access to food and water, vector-borne illness, storms, kind of all of it, the exacerbation of air pollution, and really look at what's happening with brains in that really critical time of early development. Now, this slide is way too busy, but I'm just take the gestalt in a little bit. So basically, at the bottom, you've got those indirect and direct climate risks I mentioned that are happening, and then they feed up through a bunch of factors that determine outcomes. I've already touched on equity, as if you're a person, you live in a low-income country, for example, without access to adequate healthcare, infrastructure, pieces like that. Maybe you live in poor housing, these sorts of things, then that's going to feed into you being disproportionately exposed. If it's your third house in Miami Beach that gets damaged in a storm, you're probably going to be okay. Then there are the resources you have access to. So it includes kind of, again, that infrastructure sort of resource access, the environment you live in, all the resources surrounding you is another factor. And all of this then feeds into the processes that impact a developing brain. And that can be everything from an injury, a head injury in a severe storm as a family's fleeing, something like that, right on through to epigenetic impacts related to chronic stress. So really kind of cross-cutting processes that happen. And of course, our brains for all of us started developing when we were in the womb, from the earliest days and months, right on through to kind of critical stages through infancy, children, and youth. And the outcomes ultimately, our behavioral health, our mental health, our cognition, our cognitive capacity, all of these factors, these have implications for our entire lives, those early days. So again, this will be very familiar outside of the climate context, perhaps, but that's just grounding. And I'm going to go through fairly quickly a number of areas that came out in this review as impacts that are concerning. So, heat certainly, there's a lot of evidence related to heat exposure and brain development. And, the term for heat exposure, maybe as people in Canada, for those of us who are here, we're much more familiar with hypothermia, meaning we get too cold and it risk your life if you do get too cold and get hypothermic. This hyperthermia, meaning that your body gets too hot and can no longer regulate body heat, and it's just as deadly as hypothermia. So hyperthermia, really concentrating on maternal health. So during the pregnancy period, it affects both mom's health as well as the health of the developing baby. And when you see exposure to heat, when people can't get out of that heat, there can be low birth weight, preterm birth. There's a lot of evidence on that. And you might be aware that for babies that are born several weeks before they should, that does have implications for the developing brain. But sorry, right on through to earlier, talk with my hands here, I'm knocking the laptop around. Right from the earliest stage, from neural tube development, this is the earliest developmental period of the brain, and that first trimester, if mom's getting too hot, is not able to thermoregulate because she's exposed to too much heat, you get brain development impacts. And then postnatally, you can imagine that for infants and children, heat interrupts sleep, the ability to think, like especially you think about a kid that has a bad night's sleep, it's way too hot. They go into a hot school after a hot walk. They can't think in that environment, going home and then repeating that. And we see that in the summertime in Canada, but you can imagine as well in other countries where there are more and prolonged heat exposures, how this affects things. And then there's injury due to heat stroke itself. It's just getting way, way too hot in an environment. So weather extremes and stress, there's some really interesting longitudinal data that's shown that when you're exposed to, and it could be a range, it could be a devastation of housing and livelihoods in Bangladesh, families having to flee. You can imagine the enormous stress and strain on the entire family unit, relevant to maternal health right on through. And as well, too, there's some good evidence from things like the ice storm in Eastern Ontario and Quebec about, gosh, that was like 20-ish years ago. But you do see when there's been this toxic period of stress, impacts on the cognitive capacity of the children and youths. And even years and years later, these can become evident. And there's some discussion of even epigenetic impacts. So when you have a toxic stress exposure, even next generations can be affected by that. As well, too, if the child has epilepsy, for example, any extreme stress situation, of course, can make that much worse, along with any other condition, really. Air pollution is both exacerbated by climate change, but also its own risk, right? So there's quite a bit of evidence about worsening exposure to fine particulate, for example, and neurodevelopment, whether it's neurodevelopmental conditions, cognitive capacity, all these kinds of things. And I've done research showing that the closer you are, for example, to a large highway or a big pollution emitter, the more likely you are to have these brain development impacts. And they've shown this like through imaging as well as through all kinds of cognitive tests and so on, grades in schools, all these pieces. And here, I'll jump ahead of myself a bit. You can imagine the equity implications too. If we think about who's living closer to those highways, who's living closer to those factories, closer to that toxic waste, with all these factors getting worse when you get heat domes and extreme weather events happening, it's often will be Indigenous communities, Black communities, other equity deserving communities. And there you start to see these really disproportionate risks for certain communities and at the country level too, right? Disease. So here you'll probably in Canada be most familiar with Lyme disease. We hear warnings about that all the time. Check yourself, check your kids for ticks if you've been out in High Park or you've been out in the woods. But as our it gets warmer and warmer, we're seeing diseases that in the past might have been hundreds or thousands of miles south of us, for example, here in Canada, coming up into Canada. I have a close friend who nearly died from West Nile virus a couple of years ago, and Long Island Sound is where that happened. So these things are starting to find their way, but in earlier stages, getting these illnesses can have anything from a mild to a profound impact on developing brain, and perhaps more relevant to countries that really rely on seafood is you do see algae blooms and neurotoxins and things like that turning up in the food supply, again related to climate change, which has brain impacts. Let's see how we're doing for time here. Pretty good. Some obvious things. Again, I'm not. This is probably fairly intuitive. If the mom, if the child or the infant is not getting a decent amount, a decent quality of food, obviously there's impacts to the entire system. And I should say, along with direct brain health, brain development impacts, like a part of the developing brain is how we thrive, how children grow and learn, right? Is being able to engage the environment, play with stuff, test things, go out, explore, learn. And you can imagine that when you're hungry, when you are overheated, exhausted, haven't slept, those infants and children can't explore, they can't engage the environment in a normal and really healthy way. And that itself has implications for learning and development. Equity I've touched on a bit already. Maybe I'll tease out just a few pieces here. So, the countries that are most impacted by climate change with all these ripple out effects related to brain development are going to be low and middle income countries, which have contributed the least to the problem. We've been doing quite a few reviews around disproportionate impacts on girls and women, and there are a range of factors there. Generally speaking, you'll see factors like when there's a climate emergency, the kinds of decisions that can be made about who gets more food, who goes to school, who needs to go to work to support the family. Often those things can break out along the lines of girls being deprived of those advantages more than boys. And a number of other factors just across all the things I've been talking about. If you look at any research that breaks things out along sex and gender lines, you do see these disproportionate impacts. And I've already touched on Indigenous and Black populations. There's certainly quite a bit of work being done on that. Just down the road, if you want to read up on her, is Ingrid Waldron at McMaster, has done some great work on disproportionate exposure of Black populations to environmental risk, but then also, importantly, the lack of inclusion of Black communities in alerts and messages and education about climate change, but also involvement in climate advocacy. So she's doing some important work along those lines, just by way of a couple of examples. So this isn't a good slide, and it is a good slide. It isn't a good slide because probably way too many words, but the message I want to get here is there's a lot of very real and very disturbing risks that are unfolding, but at the same time, it's really important to focus on action. Because I think, I myself, like doing this review, learning about this kind of thing, it can be very disheartening and lead to sort of some negative feelings related to our future. But what I take heart in is there's a lot of guidance, a lot of good direction about what can be done. Through some of those here, just to think about. I've mentioned a fair bit low and middle income countries, right, where the exposures are far worse. There's something called loss and damage commitments. You'll be familiar with the COP meetings. The most recent was the COP 30 meeting in Brazil, where internationally leaders of countries come together to plan, coordinate, and respond to the climate crisis. Now, I'm not going to get into the critiques of this meeting process, what's been accomplished, what hasn't been accomplished, all of those kinds of things. But since the 1990s, the COP meetings, as well as beyond that, they've been talking about something called loss and damage funds. The idea that high income countries, which have contributed the most to the climate crisis, need to transfer large amounts of money to low and middle income countries to help them build resilience and be better able to address the disproportionate climate impacts. And those are called loss and damage commitments. The latest and most substantial one was in COP27 a few years ago. That is yet to be really realized to much of it, a substantive extent. And there are criticisms that this has been a discussion for a long time and hasn't happened. So that's something to circle back to. I think we need to build evidence in this area. Like it's always, perhaps now more than ever, an uphill battle trying to convince funders, governments that this is a priority. We really need to focus on this, that perhaps in front of many other things. And I think to do that, we need evidence. And in the reviews that we do, there isn't a lot of integrative evidence really pulling the things I'm talking about together to say climate change is driving these impacts. And importantly, things like the economic arguments for action. I mean, governments, we can try and convince them about distress, about the suffering and deprivation many populations experience. But can we also make an economic argument that if whole populations are having these exposures, these developmental impacts, then that has impacts on whole populations' ability to be productive, to contribute as citizens, all of the stuff that governments can be interested in. So we need more evidence there. We need to enforce emission control policies. This is where some of the work I'm doing is, and colleagues as well, is to try and understand what unfolds in those homes where it might be single mom, 2 jobs, couple of kids in an environment that's way too hot in the summertime, air quality is poor. How can we, in a nuanced way, understand how risk unfolds? One is to understand how we can better intervene. But then the other thing is to call this out as, rights violations, to help give evidence and get some clout behind, enforcing standards. Many cities in Canada and beyond are looking at maximum indoor temperature legislation, which is really important, basically saying that landlords and most people rent, right? As landlords, you are required to keep the temperature below a certain threshold, like 26 degrees. But we need to look at how that can be enforced. Not just we can set a policy, but if that's not helping that person, again, somebody trying to raise their kids in an overheated apartment, they don't know their legal recourse, so there's no consequences. It's meaningless. Other areas are to increase resilience in our education and healthcare systems. I think maternal health can be a good point of leverage. This is a wicked problem. We could be doing 100 different things at once. But how can we, for women that are considering having kids, who are pregnant, who have little kids, how can we center and make relevant education in the right languages that are culturally relevant to help educate and support so that these risks aren't unfolding? There's avoidable risks that could be reduced. Other pieces that I should say that are grounded in some evidence is cash transfers. So when there's an immediate impact, like say Yellowknife, there's an evacuation, there's a huge air quality problems, all of these pieces come together. How can we fairly quickly engage? It's for those who need it. Like I said, it's not the person with their third home affected. Cash transfers to help create a buffer so they can experience less stress, so they can get their lives on track. And speaking with the conversations with a number of First Nations folks and communities in the North and our think tanks, and many have talked about how when there's an emergency and evacuation, there will be a few weeks of intensity, some coming in, often in not a great or community engaged process doing evacuations. People come back, a bit of support, and then they're gone. The impacts from these events can last years. Livelihoods can be lost, houses can be lost or impacted. So how can these supports last proportionate in a way that's proportionate to the impacts? And all of this spills out into, the little kids that are trying to grow up in these environments. And then targeted interventions. I think that this is repeatedly there as we can put out various forms of policy guidance, healthcare guidance, and so on. But if it's not getting out there in a way that's in a language that people understand, that's been co-created with communities involved and that are culturally relevant, the impact's much, much less. And then I'm going to end on a couple things, wrapping up. So I'm going on a little too long. Sorry, Eric. So I got a couple things. One thing, I'll let you read this yourself. Just thinking about my own daughter, like the group that's often the least engaged are in fact the most impacted. These are young people, right? And I think that there's a lot of potential, a lot of input to be had in co-design and cultivating youth leadership in this space that's been untapped and underappreciated. And lastly, I'll just end up here again. You've got the website where you can read more about what we're up to. There's a group called Eco Neuro, and this is an international collaboration of people doing work on neurological or health, updates on evidence, all that good stuff. So if you want to dig deeper, that is a place to go. So with that, I'll pass it on to Eric here.
Thanks very much, Sean and Ashley, for the introduction, and everyone for being here and watching online. Really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to talk about this obviously really important topic. I'll try not to repeat too much of what Sean said. Thanks for setting the stage. So we'll fast forward a bit chronologically into late life issues, talking about the impact of climate change on the mental health of older adults and their brains. I put this slide up here. This is the biopsychosocial approach. So I think you've got a sense from Sean already, but we can't just talk about the brain, right? Any health condition, any mental health condition, you can maybe theoretically reduce it to biology, but obviously it's much bigger than that. So you have to look at the biology, the psychological factors, and the social factors to really understand it. And I think this framework is very important for climate change as well. I'll talk about what's happening to the brain, the impacts of heat and disasters on the brain. But these issues are going to impact different people in very different ways. And people who are more vulnerable because of their social circumstances, their lack of access to air conditioning, SES, people who are displaced from their homes, living in coastal communities, or people who have lost their jobs, they're going to be disproportionately impacted, including on their brain. Psychologically, the factors are also key to know. We're talking about people who are becoming anxious or hopeless or having cognitive impairment and less able to cope with the changing world and the stressors. I've also put in some faded circles to represent the concept that cross-sectionally is not enough to understand someone's health condition or their brain or what they're going through, and that everything that Sean just spoke about in terms of development and adulthood also applies to older adults who are in front of you, that we acquire experiences and exposed circumstances and health conditions that impact our whole life trajectory and the way we experience health and the way we experience the world. So keep that in mind as we're going through these topics. I think the idea of dementia illustrates this well, and I'll be talking about dementia a little bit later on, but this graphic I love, I include in many of my talks. It's from the Lancet Commission on Dementia Risk Factors, and shows that dementia, although it doesn't have a cure, has many different potentially avoidable risk factors that if you could modify them, potentially you could reduce the risk of someone getting dementia or how often or when they get dementia. So it could delay things if you're able to avoid some of these risk factors. So they talk about education in early life, hearing loss, depression, hypertension, obesity, excessive alcohol. All of these things have a component of risk that increases an individual's risk of dementia. And climate change is going to be impacting many health conditions in a similar way. Air pollution has specifically been called out by the Lancet Commission as a known risk factor for dementia, where particulate matter 2.5 increases the risk of dementia. So first we'll talk about heat. So I have three scary pictures. The first one on the left is from NASA. It's the global temperatures from 1880 to present. You can see that since the Industrial era, global average temperatures have been increasing, and it's increased over 1 degree Celsius. The middle graph shows the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we know burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. That's been steadily increasing also in an exponential way. It's a greenhouse gas, so it helps the Earth retain heat. And on the right shows the temperature and weather monitoring stations across the country. In Canada, the circles represent a station. The ones in red are the ones where there have been significantly more extreme heat days. So you can see that this is bearing out in our day-to-day life. We are experiencing extreme heat events all across the country, and the temperature is rising across the world. When we're talking about impacts of climate change, there's things happening now, and much of the evidence I'm going to present talks about what we've already seen. But keep in mind, there's a lag effect for all these exposures, and climate change is getting worse. Temperatures continue to rise. So if we're already seeing signal now, these present exposures are what people are going to deal with 20 years from now. And in 20 years from now, if things are worse, then that pushes it out. So you can see how there's an urgency to this issue. So how does heat affect older adults? Well, older adults biologically are less able to adapt to high heat. So they are the most at risk in high heat days, which are already occurring. So they have impaired thermal regulation. So the way we get rid of heat is by radiating off our skin. Our skin stays cool through sweat. When it evaporates, that cools it. How does our blood get to our skin? Through vasodilation. The blood vessels get bigger. That's why we get flushed. And how does the blood get through our body, the warm blood, get back to the skin? It's through our heart. Unfortunately, with older adults, they're not as good at sweating. They're not as good at vasodilation, and their heart isn't as good. So that impacts their ability to get rid of heat. Medications also impact heat. And this is important for our psychiatric patients, but all older adults may be more likely to be on medications. Common ones like diuretics, antihypertensives, anticholinergics, and psychotropics can all impair thermal regulation. Older adults are more prone to dehydration because they have impaired thirst and can have impaired renal function. And mobility limitations can prevent access to cold spaces. They may have a decreased perception or awareness of heat strain, so they may be less likely to act on feeling hot. They may be more likely to have type 2 diabetes or hypertension, two conditions which interact with the other old age factors that put people at higher risk. And so how does this play out? Well, in heat waves, we see older adults more likely to get heat-related illness, more likely to get heat stroke, and more likely to die. We see that these effects are more pronounced in people who have low SES and in areas with low prevalence of air conditioning. So it's a direct result of our environments that we're living in. Extreme heat days reduce kidney function, which feeds back to medications and dehydration. We see an increase in hospitalization in older adults for renal, respiratory, and heat causes, and increased medical emergencies. So that's some physical health. Mental health as well is also directly impacted by heat. We know that a hot brain is not a good brain. You have oxidative stress and inflammation. Right now, your brains are warming up because I'm making you a bit. Your brain heats up 2 or 3 degrees, and it deals with that. To deal with that, again, it relies on cerebral blood flow. Get that warm blood out of the brain, bring cool blood in. And unfortunately, that can be impaired in certain conditions like Alzheimer's. A brain that's too hot is likely to get some swelling and damage, ischemia. So this JAMA 2022 paper looked at what is the impact of high heat days across US counties compared to normal on emergency visits. And we're seeing already that the warmer the heat days, the more likely people are to present to the emergency room with mental health conditions writ large, and specifically for substance use disorders, anxiety, mood, psychotic disorders, and self-harm. And in older adults, this is also true. A meta-analysis looked at 76 studies that looked at temperature and mental health visits in older adults and found across the board that there's an increased risk of hospital admissions and visits as temperature rises, and an increased risk in mortality from mental disorders as temperature rises. So this is something we, at CAMH need to be aware of as a risk factor for mental illness, crises, and death. Heat-related illness is associated with an increased risk of dementia. So let's back up a bit and talk about dementia, because I think this is one of the biggest problems of our time. So dementia, or major neurocognitive disorder, is a chronic acquired reduction in cognitive function. So some cognitive faculty like memory or language or executive function or attention has been reduced, and it's reduced to an extent that it's having an impact on daily life. That's dementia. It's caused by many different things. There's different kinds of dementia, but the most common one is Alzheimer's. In Canada, there's over 700,000 people living with dementia, and between 2020 and 2050, there will be 6 million Canadians with dementia. There's no cure for dementia, but delaying dementia is possible, and that's in some ways, good enough, because if you it's an old age condition. If you can delay it long enough, that move it from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s, it becomes less and less disruptive to people's lives and society and caregivers. And that's extremely important. And even small delays, like if you can avoid some of those risk factors and delay dementia by a year, if you can do that across the population, that dramatically reduces the number of cases and the burden to society. So some good news before I get into the bad news is that this is actually already happening. Many of those risk factors are things that have improved, including in some places air pollution, right? We've phased out some coal plants. Air pollution is much better than the smog days of the past. Education is better. Cardiovascular disease prevention is better. And so what we're seeing already among the, say, 70-year-olds of today, the percentage of people with dementia is actually lower than among the 70-year-olds a couple decades ago. So the per population incidence is actually going down a little bit, although there's way more older people, so the overall prevalence is still going up. I hope this doesn't get jeopardized by climate change and other factors, because we know that extreme heat and wildfire smoke can contribute to developing dementia. And so the corollary of, reducing the risk a little bit helps a lot. Increasing the risk a little bit hurts a lot as well. So we need to be aware of this. What is currently the known risk between heat-related illness and risk of dementia? We have some information from epidemiologic studies. A cohort study in Taiwan using a large research database looked at 70,000 people from 2001 to 2015 who experienced a heat-related illness. And then they matched them to controls of people of the same age, sex, and the same time to 282,000 control patients. And then they followed all of those people forward to look at what is the difference in a risk of developing dementia compared to the people who did have heat-related illness and didn't. And what they found was that a heat-related illness or heat stroke both increased the risk of developing cognitive impairment down the line by 25% or 1.25. This group also did an animal model to study to see like what could be happening here. What does heat-related illness do to the brain as it relates to Alzheimer's? And what they found in the mice was that the hippocampus was smaller, damaged, and there were amyloid plaques. And these are two of the three hallmark features of Alzheimer's disease: having a shrunken brain with damage, especially in the hippocampus where memories are formed, having amyloid plaques that build up across different lobes, and neurofibrillary tangles. So we see that potentially heat illness is increasing the risk of dementia. What about people who already have dementia? They're at a much higher risk of getting very sick. An analysis of US emergency visits showed that compared to normal days, 50th percentile days, very hot days at the 95th percentile, so associated with a 4% increase in emergency room visits with Alzheimer's. And likewise, another large US study published in JAMA Internal Medicine found that after the hottest days, people with dementia more likely to be admitted to hospital, and after several days, that risk continued to increase. So again, we're looking at populations. There are going to be some people who aren't bothered by heat. They're going to be in their homes with air conditioning, and they have their groceries delivered, and they have a private caregiver, and they may not even notice that there's a heat wave. Yet there's going to be other people who are deeply impacted. So the overall average doesn't tell the full story. There's certain populations that are going to be severely impacted. And this study, fortunately, did look at race as one of those factors, and indeed found that among non-whites, there was a 3 times higher risk than this average. So zoom to the West Coast now and talk about the Western heat dome and what we learned about that. So just briefly, it was a major heat wave, you might remember, because the town of Lytton was all over the news when it burnt down from the wildfires. There was a record temperature set in Canada, almost 50 degrees. The intensity of this heat dome, this heat wave, and the fires were attributed to climate change. So 619 people in BC died, and zooming out a little bit, 808 people died in Western Canada. But what that wildfire did was something we noticed here. The sky turned orange, there was smoke in the air. Wildfires contain particulate matter 2.5, and that's the particulate matter that has already been associated with developing cognitive impairment. We inhale it, it affects our lungs, it increases inflammation, and inflammation goes straight to the brain and is likely contributing to cognitive impairment. It's linked to many different health conditions and linked to thousands of deaths per year in Canada. Dementia is going to be increased if air pollution is increased. So it may cause 188,000 cases of dementia per year. Forest fires aren't the only source of particulate matter. Air traffic or car traffic is one of them, and that's one areas where things have improved. Lead has been removed. That was another factor, an area of research that I'm interested in. But these forest fires are contributing a lot, and you can see in the rainbow on the right that this is just one snapshot in time, but the smoke traveled all across the continent, and in some places in very high levels. So the dark red is over 10 micrograms per cubic meter. And one study, an analysis of 12 studies showed that there's a dose-dependent increase. The higher the air pollution, the higher the risk of dementia. So per 1 microgram per cubic meter increment in particulate matter 2.5, you have a 3% increase in dementia. These are big numbers. So heat and fire aren't the only effects of climate change. We also see extreme weather events like typhoons and hurricanes and floods. In 2018, there was a flood in Japan. A meter of rain in 10 days caused flash flooding, 237 fatalities, 6,700 houses were destroyed. And because of the population of Japan and because of the areas that it hit, most of the victims were older adults. So what does this do to older adults? Well, they knew from previous natural disasters that actually there's an accelerated cognitive decline among older adults who are struck by disasters. And so they sought to see, did this also happen after the flood in Japan? They looked at a cohort of 260,000 recipients of health insurance, another registry. So these are people who are living either in long-term care homes or receiving home care. So an older adult population requiring healthcare support damaged by the flood. And they identified people from the registry before the flood from May to June and compared it to data after the flood in July and December. In that data set of 260,000, about 3,000 were flood victims. And what they found was that cognitive decline occurred across the board for this population, but among the people who had their houses destroyed or damaged, cognition declined significantly more. This was an effect that was seen in private homes, but not in care facilities. Interesting. So Sean spoke about mitigation and what we can do. I'll just add a few points from my perspective. I think as we work with people with mental illness and with health conditions, we need to understand what's going on. We need to take a biopsychosocial approach. We need to understand the risk factors. We need to realize that you can't separate mental health from health, and you can't separate health from the environment. All of these things interact in complex ways. I think we need to think to the future when we're dealing with climate change, because it's a rapidly changing things, and many of these impacts have large lag effects, especially when we're talking about conditions like dementia in older adults. You know, the children experiencing these exposures now are going to be older adults in a few decades. We need to, you know, even when I was a resident 10 years ago, we weren't talking about heat waves. We were talking about cold days, right? We were talking about the potential need for psychiatric admission because it was, you know, they were homeless and it was too cold to go outside. But the attention to heat is now there. So we need to think about these risks in the patients we do, in the social work we do. You know, we counsel people on exercise and diet, but should we be counseling them on HEPA filters and air conditioners and mitigating their, you know, their resilience and their risks, and thinking about that. So there's things we could do right now, and a lot of that work is being done with the collaborative group now, and CAMH's heat response strategy has a lot of great information there. Yeah, I think that's, I don't want to repeat things that you said, so I think that's where I can end it. And thank you for your time. We can move on to questions.
Great. Thank you very much for those great presentations. In a short period of time, you took us through the whole kind of life cycle and the various impacts that are possible and likely due to heat exposure and particulate matter and other climate change related things. A lot of layers I was noting and trying to unpack. I'd love to hear some questions from the audience. I can't see people in the room, so if there are any hands that go up in the room, maybe I'll ask one of you to just take the question directly, and just stop me if that is the case. I don't see any questions online at the moment, but of course, if you do have one and you'd like to raise your hand, please go ahead. I'll just maybe start with a couple as people are thinking. So, uh, being an educator, I teach a course called Planetary Health. I'm always interested in the, how effective education can be. And Sean, you touched on this point a little bit about how we can maybe introduce education into the health system for patients, for example, mothers who are expecting or thinking of getting pregnant, just, on the risks and potential, mitigation strategies. I just wonder if you have any other thoughts around how we can really approach education so that it is more likely to lead to action. I think, there's one thing about becoming more aware of these potential health impacts, particularly on mental health and the developing brain. But how do we deliver it in such a way that we can actually encourage people to act and change their behaviors and look for solutions? Any thoughts on that from either of you?
Gonna have to play a little bit of musical question, Ashley. Thanks for that. And I have a few thoughts related to education and how to approach it. One is framing. Uh, I think there, you know, just happened to some modest extent the pandemic. There's an opportunity oriented and reactive, and even only about climate change. I think a lot of the real solutions here, along with mitigation and reducing the causes of climate change. There's a real opportunity where if we get more prevention oriented, if we have more equitable access to basic resources in society, if we get upstream of these issues, we're not only addressing environmental risk exposures, but we're addressing whole societal well-being, improving health across the board, environmental risk aside. So I think where in education, like we do need to acknowledge the crisis and immediate impacts. I think where we can set that within the broader structural context of the opportunity of prevention and getting upstream and how that can have whole society benefits as well as environmental risk, offsetting those risks. I think that's really important. And then also I think that balance, we always need to be coming back to mitigation and addressing the causes, but is really helping people see their own role in responding. I was at a presentation recently by a First Nations community leader who spoke about looking after the land and being a steward of the land, even the small bit of land that your own home is on. And the idea of like that, taking that responsibility, even though it might just a tiny front yard or plants you have on your patio or whatever the thing is, but to take that responsibility to feel connected to the ecosystem, to feel like we're all having a part in what we can do. So I think amidst these large system pieces, I think it's important also to locate our own responsibilities and roles. So I'll stop there. I think there could be a lot more said, but I don't know if Eric, you want to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I think not too much to add, but I think that there's a lot of good education that happens currently in healthcare around the social determinants of health. And so I think different medical schools have different approaches to how that's taught. The residents I supervise have a good understanding of these concepts. So I think that's probably the in. Like these are um, these are becoming more and more relevant among the other things that are extremely important determinants of health. And so it needs to be integrated into curricula as evidence emerges and as we understand it. I think buy-in, the other comment, I think the topic of climate change has become interestingly politicized, especially in places like the US, but also in Canada. And so I think it's very helpful from an education perspective to remember that and to be as specific and evidence-based as possible. And when you review the literature, there's actually a ton of information already there and a lot of facts, right? So, you know, I would say that we need to be specific, factual, evidence-based, and embed it within existing curricular structures so that our next generation of healthcare providers are able to, understand this and carry the torch as the situation unfolds and be prepared for major changes, but just be thinking with that lens. And that way, when they come across new information and new papers, you can integrate it into a framework that already makes sense and you already get, and not one that you dismiss because of your political views or whatever.
Thank you. Thank you both for those responses. I did see a question online, Christopher Tosh, but then your hand came down, so I'm not sure if you still want to ask your question or if you decided not to ask. If you want to ask, go ahead and unmute. If not, then we have another question online from Ruth, who says, thanks for drawing attention to the impact of air pollution on brain health. I've spoken to Sean about this link before, as Hamilton is trying to consider how we can describe the community impact of air pollution on brain health through health status reporting. It's a very new area. Sorry, I just lost. What indicators and outcomes, etc. Any new thoughts on this effort? And it's important in helping to build the evidence for local population health action.
Yeah, we could jump in.
Maybe for Sean.
So I guess in terms of indicators and outcomes related to air pollution and our topic at hand here, brain development and brain health, I can speak to a few. The more in terms of the studies that have been done at a population level, they will tend to be using sort of proxy measures like achievement levels in schools and looking at how school achievement is unfolding in areas that are more exposed to air pollution versus not control for all the different other variables that might be involved. So these kind of proxy measures, it's not perfect, but it is relevant. In some instances, there have been more in-depth sort of studies of doing assessments, and in certain countries around the world, they pretty routinely do cognitive assessments with children and youth, basic cognitive assessments. You're able to look at those factors. I think those definitely have some value and can definitely help show where risks occurring and then the extent and nature of the risk. There's also diagnosis of neurodevelopmental condition as a function of, say, postal code, for example. And you can look closer you are to major pollutants or emitters, the more likely you are to see might be rates of attention deficit disorder, that kind of thing. I think there's that evidence, but the evidence that's probably missing to a larger extent is that much more nuanced evidence of what unfolds in people's living environments. For example, some colleagues of mine that do work in indoor environmental quality can speak to when you actually get into a home, let's say during the summer, during a heat wave, when there's a heat island effect, the pollution's bad. You're in a home where, say, the windows don't work or the ventilation's bad. There's dampness in the walls. There are many people living in rooms, and then there's cooking happening, and you can measure the air quality in these environments, and you see, as bad as it is outside, it's far worse inside. So to really and they figure out who's exposed as well. A downside of using a postal code is you have many different. There might be postal codes associated with more poverty, for example, but you get a huge range. So I think that's where we can really, we could use more data as trying to understand those more specific risks that are happening within households and the experiences of it as well. I mean, I think we've all probably seen where population level data in terms of influencing change, sometimes that we have tons of evidence about risk, but it doesn't seem to shift things much. There is a role for lived experience and lived experts to come forward and share what they're actually living with in these environments, what their kids are experiencing, what their parents and grandparents are experiencing, and weaving those very human and very real individual and social impacts as well as a form of evidence. So I'll stop there, but I mean, I think it's kind of trying to triangulate around all these factors that at the end of the day lead to people just losing capacity, the kind of silent missed opportunity, right, of a kid who grows up and is has their cognitive capacities reduced by 5-10% as a function of this. What might their life trajectory have been if that didn't happen? What opportunities could have there been there for them and their families and society? So anyways, trying to tease this stuff out, I think, is important. I don't know, Eric, no, okay.
Thank you, Sean. And I know that we're kind of close to time, but I did want to give Christopher the floor. If you have a quick question, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if we've gone past the point of no return according to the environmental clock. Are all the topics today pre-environmental say, oh, it's too late. We can't come back from like a planet level extinction or just mental decline. Is it all over? What's
Yeah,
going
no,
on?
such an important question, and I hear you, Christopher. We hear so many different messages about what's involved, these projections, and I think that an aspect of what you're describing is certainly, at least from my understanding of the climate scientists, very real. Is that we are passing certain thresholds where there are going to be very real and profound impacts. They're already happening, but these arcs of risk are increasing. They're going to continue to increase, and turning it back gets harder and harder with time. At the same time, I do think there do still remain many opportunities to still have an impact. It's where there are going to be impacts for sure, but there's an opportunity to still reduce risks in the longer haul, looking ahead generations, as well as there's some pretty basic stuff we can do to just reduce those exposures for people who are in bad housing, lacking housing, who are way more exposed to poor air, heat, all of these factors related to our topic today. There is actually quite a bit that can be done. It's sort of shifting the focus and shifting investment there. So a lot of work to be done, but I would say that I do, as much as I think these are very serious risks, I do think there is an opportunity. The last thing I'll say is we need more work in which folks like Eric, myself, others at CAMH and beyond, we're more actively collaborating with climate scientists. I think Eric alluded to this, that any research we're doing now, any solution we're designing right now, by the time we get 10 years down the road, which would be fast in terms of implementing something at scale, it's out of date. It's not going to be meeting the risks. So we need to work more closely with climate scientists. And so we're kind of designing our work for where we're going to be in several years, as opposed to the situation right now. So trying to be more forward looking in that way. But I do appreciate your question. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for those questions. And I'm sorry we won't get to all of them. There are a couple more in the chat. But I just want to wrap up and thank our speakers very much for their very intriguing and informative presentations. And just a reminder to everyone that these sessions are recorded and posted online on the Collaborative Center's YouTube channel, as well as with links on the Collaborative Center website. So if you want to revisit this presentation, you can. I want to thank our audience members for joining us today, and stay tuned for our next session coming up in February, I think. Thanks, everyone. Take care and enjoy your
Thanks
lunch.
very much.